this virus thing will go away relatively soon. Well, I'd like to introduce Darcy Talenko to you. Darcy is our Purdue Extension Field Crops plant pathologist, and she's going to talk to us a little bit today about what she's seen with the tar spot. She was up in our region quite a bit the last year or two looking at tar spot, and as you all know, Elkhart County, St. Joe County, we're probably ground central for this last round of tar spot this last year. So
you can watch the movie, but I don't know how to tell you.
Okay, Larry, Larry Enders, I can hear you. Can you see us?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, I'm in.
All right, great. We're glad to have you. Okay. So, Darcy, why don't we turn it over to you, and you can show your slides and go through your presentation, and then we'll have time for questions, so we can go from there.
Yep. Well, it's good to be joining you, even though we're trying remotely. I think we're all learning a little bit on how to use some of these online tools. So today I'm going to present some of the stuff I have on the tar spot that I would have given at the meeting in person. Please feel free to save your questions, or if you need to unmute yourself or raise your hand, let Jeff know, and you can interrupt me if you want to go back and look at things. I probably have more slides than I have an hour, but I just want to show you what we've kind of learned in the last year and a half, and then what to look forward to, or what we're watching for the next years. So here I'm going to quickly share my screen. Just give me a second, and I want to start recording just in case. And I'm gonna, let's see if this will work. Okay. So can you see my PowerPoint slide?
Yes.
Clear? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Then I'm gonna turn off my video, or if you know, I'm just gonna look at the screen, so it'll do a different screen than I'm looking at the camera. Anyhow, so I just want to give you an update on the field crop diseases we see, and specifically talk about tar spot from this 2019 season and what we've learned the last year and a half. As just a reminder, there's a number of resources my team has been developing for Indiana. We have a Purdue Field Crop Pathology website there at extension.purdue. I try to keep an updated blog there. Right now, there's some information on COVID and other things presented there that the Bob has put together on his Corny News. In addition, as I talk about some of this work, we do now put together a applied research summary from the 2019 field season. So there's 70 pages of data there if you're interested in looking at it, or if you want to look more fully into some of these trials I'm talking about. All that summary data is present in that document as well. We have some new extension publications that are available both on tar spot and both here in Indiana and in the multi-states. They're going to be updated soon, because if you look at them, the maps are last year's maps. So we are working on getting new ones out, and hopefully they'll be out in the next couple months as well. I just want to remind you that there are other diseases we generally see. So gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight are some of our major diseases we see in corn across Indiana. Of course, tar spot in northern Indiana has become our big problem, so we're working a lot on that. But I just want to acknowledge that we do keep track of some of these other diseases. We do watch for southern rust, where we had some of that move into the state as well. Just to know that my program, we're trying to track as much as we can and keep you updated on all the various diseases that we see both in corn and then also in soybeans. Soybeans were relatively quiet this year, but we do look at some of these major diseases. I have a grad student that's looking on frog eye, and it's QOI, the strobilurin resistance. So we're trying to map that in the state, as well as some various other diseases that could be around. And then finally, we do also do wheat in our program. So we are getting ready to set up our wheat fungicide trials, hopefully in the next month or so. Generally, we're looking for Fusarium head blight and how to manage that one, but we do track the other wheat diseases as well throughout the state. So there's some other, we don't just work on tar spot, but today I'm just going to focus mostly on what we've done for the last year and a half. So the background on tar spot, I started here at Purdue in August of 2018, and that's when we started to see some real significant yield impacts of tar spot. And so it's been nothing but tar spot for the last year and a half for me, learning about this new disease. As a reminder, when we talk about diseases, it's really important to remember the disease triangle. First, we need to have that susceptible host, whether it's a plant species or variety or hybrid that's susceptible to that disease. It needs to be present in that field. Then we need to have that pathogen. So is it overwintering? Generally our standard diseases, gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, frog eye, they all overwinter in the debris. And so they're here annually, and it just depends on that environmental conditions, what's gonna happen for that disease that year. And now with tar spot, we also know that that is overwintering here in Indiana. So again, the big factor is what is the environmental conditions? Are they conducive for the diseases? Is the temperature conditions right? Do we have enough leaf wetness and leaf moisture for those spores to infect and cause disease? Or are the conditions going to favor something else in the field? So again, the environment is going to be a key factor, and especially tar spot as we talk a little bit about this disease as it moves along. In those areas where it goes hot and dry, generally we don't see a lot of our fungal pathogens. So in the central and southern part of Indiana this past year, we really didn't see much tar spot. I could find it in areas, but we really didn't see it. It's up around the Lake Michigan area where we have lots of moisture that we're going to really see the impact of this disease on our corn production. So again, favorable environments when we see the disease explode, and with tar spot, the environment is going to be a key factor. When we look at managing field diseases in field crops, generally, if we can find genetic resistance, that's going to be the first important thing. If we get out there, again, if we can eliminate the susceptibility of that host to that disease, then we may not need that additional input for a pesticide or fungicide application. Crop rotation and sanitation both may act on that host and plant pathogen. You're rotating away from a susceptible host. Again, we give another year away from whatever inoculum's there in the field to not have a plant that it can infect. So sometimes we talk about eliminating inoculum, fall tillage, burying it in the soil, or avoiding the spread if we have a soil-borne pathogen between fields. Generally, what we're seeing though with tar spot is that sanitation is really not going to be as important as other things because this disease, even though it's surviving in the debris and that's the initial primary inoculum, if we have the right weather conditions, it is then moving through weather systems around other fields. And then finally, trying to make the decision, do we need to put out a fungicide application? So in general, when we talk about plant diseases and trying to understand fungicide timing, the idea is we want to be scouting in that field, seeing if the disease is active, to then make a decision to see, yes, that fungicide would be justified in putting it out into the field to protect the crop from that potential yield loss. So the idea is we're scouting in a field, we're looking for corn or soybean diseases before our ideal spray times. Corn, generally that spray time has been VT to R1 and soybeans R3. So the idea is, yes, we see the disease is active in the lower canopy. We need to protect that upper canopy, that ear leaf and above for corn. So then we make a decision to put a fungicide application out. Now that fungicide application is going to have residual protection from 2 to 3 weeks, depending on your products. And so the idea is we want to lay that fungicide down in the field where it's going to be protecting that upper canopy, where the disease may build up and cause yield losses. So maybe in one field we make a spray at VTR1 that has 2 to 3 weeks of protective activity. Maybe in another field down the road we didn't get in later, the airplanes were late. Maybe we went out at R2. And so then at R2 we have an extension of that protection into the end of the season, again giving us a little longer residual there as compared to the previous field. But again, it's going to depend on when that disease is active, where that protection needs to be placed in the field. And then finally, if we get later in the season, R5, R6, or R5 in corn, R6 in soybeans, maybe we won't need a fungicide application because the disease is not going to build up enough to cause those yield losses. So the idea is we want to put our fungicides out when they're going to reduce disease and then protect that yield that the disease could reduce. There's been some work done on gray leaf spot looking at how much disease ends up in that upper canopy by the end of the season by R5. So here, if you look at it at 5% or less of disease, we may not see very little yield loss occur. As we continue to lose that ear leaf to disease, up to 25% of that ear leaf being lost to the disease, that's when we start seeing that 10% reduction in yield. And we get higher, that's when we start seeing up to that 50% reduction. And when we talk about tar spot, we'll kind of see as we lose more of that leaf tissue, as that leaf begins to blight, that's when we're seeing those significant reductions where we see that 20 to 50% yield loss occurring. So the idea is we want to protect that ear leaf and above, but then the next question is how many bushels do we need to protect to get a return on that fungicide investment? So if we look at $3 to $4 corn here, and then the corn, and then the cost for our fungicide applications. So let's just say we have a range between 15 and 38. It may be higher or lower. On the lower end, we need to be looking at, is the fungicide giving me at least 5 bushel protection to really justify that fungicide application? And then on the higher end, are we protecting 12 bushel or more to really get a return on that investment of that fungicide? So that's just something else to consider when we're talking about this. And then when we get into tar spot, maybe the thoughts of even needing an additional second application, that's when we really need to look at these numbers and really see if it really justifies that additional input for managing these diseases. So again, some other resources that are available. We put together efficacy tables every year. They haven't quite been released yet, but we have a 2019, all the data from 2019 will be put out shortly. I'll try to send words out that they're updated. But these tables will provide a background information on how effective each of the fungicide groups are for managing the various diseases. So if you look at this one, you can see we break it down by the classes, and then there's the mixed modes of action and some of the trade names, and we give a rating on how these products work for the various diseases. So for example, if you zoom in on gray leaf spot, you can see that generally most products that do have a label, so if it's U means it's not labeled, but most products, they have an excellent to very good to excellent rating. So generally you can pick whatever you want for gray leaf spot. And what we've done on all these diseases is we bring all the data together across the United States that we've collected various research trials and give a rating. So we will be adding tar spot this year, and we will have a general rating for that one. The caveat on this one disease is that we really like 2 to 3 years of good data to give a rating, but we're putting out the ratings from 1 year of data. But it will be available, and I'll be letting you know once those tables are released. There are a number of products that will be available for tar spot management as well. But I think this is a good tool if you want to cross-reference. You have different diseases you're worried about, you can cross-reference them and see what product may give you the best control for the various diseases that you have in your field. So that's a real quick review of fungicide use. And so now I'm just going to give you the update for 2019. I just want to acknowledge there's a large number of people that have now involved in trying to understand tar spot. Last year at this time, when there were 5 pathologists in each of the major states, so Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and I guess there's a few more, but we've continued to add. There's now 9 states with confirmed tar spot, so this group is continuing to build. We've brought in breeders and map coordinators to try to bring all the tools we can together to try to get a quick handle on what this disease is going to do here in the United States. A little background, and many of you, if you've seen this in your field, you kind of already know what it looks like. So tar spot is caused by the fungus Phylochora matus. It's the only species we know that infects corn. This genus actually has over 900 named species, and each one is very species specific to a grass or a weed species. So there's a Phylochora graminis that infects some of our weed species out there in the field. That one's been around for years. But again, it's not found to infect corn. It's only this new one that is. And this disease has been in Mexico and Latin America from the early 1900s. They've been dealing with this disease. They talk about it in a complex of 2 pathogens. But here in the United States, we've only found the 1 pathogen, and 2018 showed us we only needed the Phylochora matus to really cause significant yield losses. So this pathogen, it causes these black stroma, which are the actual fungal structures growing in that husk and leaf tissue. And within those stroma, they may be they'll release their ascospores and sometimes conidia from that. And we're still trying to tease apart what is the true life, what is this life cycle, how fast is the cycle going? Once we have that initial infection, it seems to pick up and move through the crop canopy once those environmental conditions are there that are conducive for the disease. We do not believe it to be seed-borne, so it's going after, it's going to infect the green tissue on those leaves. If there's not green tissue to infect, we're not going to get the infection by the Phylochora. The other problem with this pathogen is that it's an obligate parasite, which means that it requires a living host, just like our rusts. And so in our labs, we can't really grow it in culture. We can't do some of the basic biology research that we want to because we can't readily grow it in culture. So a lot of the work we're relying on is going to come from the field research trials that we have going on each year. So again, this is the range of symptoms that we've seen in the field. You may have a few stroma with those black spots. Sometimes they may or may not produce this halo, which we call a fish eye. This is what was thought to be associated with that secondary pathogen in Mexico. But here in the United States, we have never been able to pull that secondary one they talk about. We see other opportunistic fungi come out of that, and we've looked at it. Some of the fusariums may colonize it, and some coniotheriums are getting in there. But the general, what we're thinking is that's just a secondary movement of opportunistic fungi moving in. Tar spot, the stroma, that phylochore is the primary infection. That's what's really causing the disease losses we see here in Indiana. So again, you can see a range in the number of stroma that form on a tissue, and it's when we get to this high end here on this picture on the right, where we have over 35% of that ear leaf being infected, that's when we really start seeing significant yield losses, especially if it moved in earlier in the season. And so that's kind of what happened in 2018, is it got a head start in the season, and then we see this rapid shutdown once it's blowing up within the canopy. Just the little biology of what we've learned on this stroma. So this is an example where we were trying to catch how early was the stroma forming in the field and what does it look like. So this is, we found one black stroma in the field here, and if we cut it and do a microscopic examination, you can see it's got this fungal structure growing within that leaf tissue, and you can see the profuse amount of ascospores that are being released just from one stroma. So that's really important, is there's a lot of inoculum once it gets going that can cause this disease to ramp up within that crop canopy. So again, we were trying to scout early and see when is it really initiating disease and how early do we need to keep an eye out for it to make those management decisions. So this is the first stroma that we found in 2019. We went back into a field that had a history of, so it had bad tar spot last year, and with our terrible planting conditions, they went back in with corn. It was irrigated. So we were looking for that ideal situation where we could find the first stroma. And so this is the one I initially found. It took me about an hour in that field before I found this. I had 3 other grad students with me trying to scout. We found one stroma that day. Again, when you're scouting for it, it's embedded in that tissue. So if you scratch at that stroma, it is not going to come off. It's growing within that tissue. There's sometimes a raised structure on the upper part of that surface. But again, that's what I tell everybody. If you think you have it, scratch at it, see if it's really growing within that tissue, because there are other things out there that may mimic it early in the season. So after finding the one, the week later, I sent my grad students back and said, hey, go to that field and see if you can find any. And this is what they, oops, sorry, oops. Got ahead of myself here. So this is what they found. So it went from 1 to hundreds on a leaf. So that's the rapid change that can occur as we have one, and then next week the conditions may be highly conducive, and then we go to hundreds of stroma on that leaf. This is still in the lower canopy, so we have time, and we were able to, the farmer was able to get up and put some fungicide sprays out there. But again, the idea is we got to scout early and often to see when it's active to make that decision on putting a fungicide spray out, because of its rapid evolution that can occur in the canopy. So some other lookalike disorders that we ran across this season. The first one mainly was being insect frass. We had a lot of early reports that they thought they had tar spot, and it turned out just to be insect frass. With insect frass, generally they're a little shinier in color, but if you take a wet paper towel or wet water and rub at it, it's going to come off. And so that's why we're telling everybody to scratch at those initial primary infections and make sure that you have tar spot. Again, we'll be scouting and we'll be watching again closely this next year. You can always send me a picture, a text, and we'll try to help identify tar spots out there in the field. Again, the clinic will have free samples sent in for tar spot monitoring as well this year. So just something to note. If you think you have it, please let us know, because we're trying to track when it comes up in the season and how wide it's going to spread across the state. Other things we also notice is Physoderma brown spot. This one generally has this purple coloring along the midrib, but as these lesions develop, they may turn a little darker. With Physoderma, if you look at it closely, it's growing within the tissue. There's nothing coming out of the tissue, so it's within that plant tissue where this disease is, as compared to tar spot. As southern and common rust mature, they turn black with age. So if you look at this picture, they kind of can mimic little black tar spots on a leaf. But if you look at your rust, and if you've seen rust in the field, it has a ruptured on the surface of that leaf where those spores are coming out. So again, in tar spot, the leaf is not ruptured. It's growing in contiguous with that stroma, but on a rust, it should be ruptured, and you might get those spores wiping off on your finger. And I think the reason we've missed it, maybe building up inoculum over the last few years, is it kind of comes in late at the end of the season. our crop is starting to shut down, and many of those saprophytic fungi are moving in, which may look like these black spots on the corn leaves. I can tell the difference between a tar spot stroma and the saprophytic fungi. Again, those stroma are still raised bumps on those surfaces and they're a little shinier. But again, if you're out scouting and at this time of the season and you're not sure, you can always send us a sample and we'll try to confirm what we see. But I think this is where we were having it build up. And then when we had those conducive conditions in 2018, that's where it got hold and took off in northern Indiana. So the life cycle of what we've come to, as we know, the fungus is overwintering in the infected residue. Last year, we took samples from a number of fields around Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois. And we looked at those samples to see how many of those ascospores are viable and are they able to germinate. And from those, we were able to prove that, yes, we can pull out a large number of ascospores. It ranged from 3,000 to 4 million in a milliliter of water. So there is a lot of ascospores out there in some of that infected tissue. But of those ascospores, the viability ranged from about 1 to 2% to up to 24%. So some of the samples we had here in Indiana, we had lower ascospore numbers, but we had a higher percent viability. But that tells us that this disease is surviving on the debris year to year. I don't know how long it survives, but we do know after 1 year at least, we can pull viable ascospores. So that's the primary inoculum for this disease in those fields that had a history. And I've been in fields where they did not have tar spot in 2018. They had soybeans in 2018, but they still had a hot spot of tar spot in 2019. So that kind of tells me that it was in the residue in 2017. We didn't catch it. It was at low levels. But then we had those conducive conditions. We had enough ascospore release and it took off within that crop canopy. So again, it is overwintering in a number of our fields. When we have those high humidity temperature conditions, then those ascospores are released. They can be forcibly ejected from those stroma. Then it's been measured in the literature up to 250 feet. So you can see we can get wide dispersal of those spores up into that lower canopy within a field. And then the cycle is going to continue. It takes about 14 to 21 days to see this black stroma appear on the leaf after infection. And then the cycle will continue multiple cycles during the season, and then finally reshed that diseased tissue to the field available for future seasons. So it is important, I think, if you had a field that was bad in tar spot, but you plant soybeans in there this year, it's important to note what fields they are because we may need to be watching it for 2 years down the road because that inoculum still may be present. And a lot of these questions we don't have the answers on, but we're trying to get how long is the survivability of these stroma in the soil, how much debris really needs to be there. And unfortunately, I think it's surviving longer than we want it to year to year. So it's going to be an annual problem here in northern Indiana. So some of the things we learned about, so in 2018 was our first epidemic where we really saw yield losses. Some of those areas we estimate about 30 bushels per acre on average across Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. In those fields, 100% of those plants are infected, and usually it's 50% or more of severity on that ear leaf. As you can see in this picture here, we get this severe blighting that occurs. It's the initial infection starts out with little black stroma, but as it gets more infected and as that leaf tissue gets consumed, we start seeing the severe blighting, and that's where we start seeing the yield losses, is we're not finishing the crop at the end. And the problem is the plant shutting down, and it's just not finishing that last weight that is expected in those crops. We looked at hybrids in the region. Everything I saw was susceptible to one level or another, but the good news is there are some hybrids that were able to keep the disease down a little, slow it down a little bit, stay green longer, and finish better than other hybrids. And again, we've got documented it in 9 states. We added both Minnesota and Missouri this year, and there's a hot spot in Florida during their winter production. So this is kind of where we first found tar spot in 2015. So in Indiana, we had 6 counties, and then there was a number of counties in Illinois. We were keeping track of it, but we weren't really thinking we were going to need to worry about it because we thought we needed both pathogens, again, which 2018 proved us wrong. But this is how we documented it in 2019. So I will turn a county red in Indiana when I have a live sample to confirm it's active in a county. And then, so initially that hot spot started in northern Indiana, and this map is going to continue to cycle through. So our hot spot is there around Lake Michigan, Porter, LaPorte, St. Joe County. You can see those initial samples are what samples were sent into the clinic, or I was called to a field. And then my team made an effort to try to get across the state to see how far we could find it. And so this is the ending, where we ended at the end 2019. So those bright red counties are new counties we added in 2019. The dark red counties are counties that we've had it in previous years. So in 2018, I got through about 38 counties finding it. So there was a hot pocket here around Indianapolis. And then, of course, Northern Indiana in 2018. 2019, we made a bigger effort to try to get out. So we were able to find it all the way down in Boise County. It was hard to find, and I'm going to show you a map of the differences and where I worry about it more, but it is there in the state. So we just need to know that the disease is moving around, it is present, but again, it's going to be environmental conditions that are going to push it in those fields where it's going to have the highest impact. You can also see where Iowa made an effort of scouting across their state. We had a hurricane that blew up in the summer and it pushed west. And so what happened is it blew all those spores west. So a lot of Iowa samples, they're finding the tar spot moving in from the top of the canopy down. So that's the difference when we're looking for it. If you have a field that has a history of tar spot, we need to be watching from that lower canopy up, watching when those first spores are being released into the lower canopy. But if you're in a field that you haven't seen it, it may be anywhere in the plant because it may be coming in on a spore shower from neighboring fields or counties or states as well. Nebraska made an effort, but they never found it in Nebraska, but we still expect it to continue to spread at both east and west directions across the U.S. So again, this is how we tracked it in Indiana. Again, 2015, 16, 17 were samples that were just sent into our clinic. 2019 is when I got out and around and we were trying to scout where we were hearing reports. And then 2019, we got into about 68 counties. I only had 2 counties where we couldn't find any and a couple fields we jumped into. I suspect it's all the way here in southeast Indiana. We just didn't get there before the corn was harvested. So a lot of these southern counties, we were chasing whether the fields had been harvested or not. But the other thing that we wanted to look at is not just, is it there, but what is the severity level? Because the severity is going to impact whether we're going to have yield losses by tar spot. So when we were in those fields, we not only looked for trying to find the stroma here, but we also rated on how many plants could we see it on, how severe was it. It's these plants where we get over this 25% severity on the upper left corner. That's where we see those significant yield losses. Knowing it's present is important because then we know the inoculum's there for future seasons, but I'm not as worried about those sites as I'm worried about those that have those significant levels of disease. So when we collected samples, we did a rating in each of those fields, and then we used that information to draw an index map for Indiana. And so this is what this shows. Out of 148 fields that we got into in 68 counties, we found it in 132. So that's about 89% of those fields we were in. We were able to find tar spot, but as you can see, it's the northern part of the state where the index, we have a darker orange-red color. Those are the fields where we see a significant infection levels, high levels of disease. I know I've heard reports that Lake County maybe should be red, but I'm just giving the results of the fields that we were able to get into. I can't get in every county, into every field in each county, but just giving a general idea of where we know the disease is going to be highest risk for our growers. So again, you can see up in here in northern Indiana is where I want you to really keep an eye out for this disease. Scout early, scout often, and then may need to think about other management tactics for it. As part of the central and southern part of the states, I'm not as worried about them unless we go cool and wet for the spring and summer. And then I'm going to be telling them to get out and look for it because it may explode. As you saw, we moved from 1 stroma to hundreds within a week. So this is the problem with the disease. If we really have conducive conditions, it could be a problem across the whole state. But I think with our lake effect weather, generally we're going to see an annual issue up in the northern part of Indiana. So we did get to we looked a little bit at variability of hybrid susceptibility, and this is a picture I showed in 2018 of one of the first fields I was in with tar spot. So this is in the middle of August up in Porter County. The grower had called me and said, there's something going on. The field should be green for another month. It's shutting down. So we get out there and you can see there's definitely a difference in hybrid susceptibility to tar spot. Every plant in this field is infected. I would say it's at 20 to 25% on the green areas, and then over 30 in those areas that are blighted. But it's also a good image to show where that morning dew sits a little longer, where we have high periods of moisture. We can push past maybe some resistance that's slowing it down. But if the environmental conditions are highly conducive, we may push this, the disease may push through some of our management tactics. So we did get out and rate, and the performance trials up at Pinney, we did have some good ratings there in 2018. And this is just an example of two hybrids. They're the same maturity group planted next to each other. So you can see that on the left, we had severe infection. We see the hybrid's gone down, it's blighted. But then on the right, we do see that it's staying green longer. It's slowed down the infection. There's still tar spot in that canopy. It's about 15 to 20%. But again, the crop is staying green longer. It's got a chance to finish and get the yield potential that's supposed to be there. And so this is another example up in St. Joe County of a field we were in 2019. Again, severe infection. The whole field is infected, but I do want to show this as a good example that there may be some variability in our hybrids and how well they can hold back the disease at least a week or so longer than maybe some of our hybrids. So again, if we can get good hybrid data, that's going to be important in selecting some hybrids that may have some resistance. I'm not quite sure the companies are there yet, but we're trying to push them to really get out and get ratings. There seems to be variability in the environments on how well the ratings, some things that rate real well in Indiana aren't rating as well in Illinois or Michigan. So again, we're trying to collect as much information, but the good news is if we can find some good resistance, we might be able to fight this disease off really well. So this is just an example getting down into the canopy. You can see we have rapid leaf blighting occurring. There's a lot of stroma forming on those upper leaves even. They're still green, but there's still a lot of stroma. And if we look at it closely, you can see there's just a profuse amount of stroma. This is where we start seeing those significant yield losses occur. But again, just as a reminder, this disease wants green tissue to infect. So if we don't have healthy green tissue, we're not going to see as much stroma forming on that corn. It's going to go after some of our best producing fields if it gets active within that crop canopy. So we tried to get a look at, I showed you the gray leaf spots example of how much ear leaf infection led to yield losses. And so in 2018, we tried to see if we could try to tie that together with tar spot on looking at ear leaf infection. And what we did is we were able to break the groups down into the 96 to 106 maturity group and 107 to 114. And what we were seeing is we see about a 0.5 bushel loss per 1% of that ear leaf loss to tar spot. So that would be like every 10%, we see about 5 bushel yield loss, up to 0.8 bushel or 8 bushel yield loss per 10% infection. So that corresponds to about 16 to 38 bushels per acre that we were seeing from those fields that had high tar spot infection. So from that, we were able to pull some information. We know we landed about 20 to 60 bushel yield loss is what we saw in 2018. I still think in 2019, we had fields that saw similar yield losses this year as well. So hopefully I'm not going too fast. So this year at Pinney, we were able to get some research trials out. I got lucky. I don't know if it's not good for the farms around Pinney, but we do have a good research site that has good disease development to try to figure out a little bit more about this disease. So here up at Pinney, we were able to track tar spot development of the canopy. And this is just looking at the amount of stroma that form on the ear leaf +2, ear leaf -2 in the crop canopy. And this is how we tracked it through the season. So we first found our first reports of tar spot occurred on the 13th of July, just north of this field trial. And then we continue to scout it throughout the season. So we start off real low through August, we're up to 5%. And then all of a sudden it explodes. We almost have an exponential increase in the amount of stroma that develops on that crop canopy within 2 weeks. So we go from this 5% to almost 25% within a couple weeks. So that's kind of what we saw in our crop canopy. And that's the problem with this disease. It starts off real low and slow, but once those conditions are conducive, it has that potential to really explode up into the canopy. So that's the changes that occurred during our ratings. So this is just looking at the black spots on those ear leaves. We also follow the necrosis, the corrosis that develops, the leaf blighting that I'm calling it. Again, it's a similar trend. It starts off slowly, and it's following along like the stroma, and then all of a sudden we have that explosion where the whole crop canopy is turning necrotic. So this is the problem with this disease again, is that once it gets going, it has a rapid development within the crop canopy. And so this is the difference between those couple weeks difference between September 21st and October 4th. As a reminder, if you look at these dates, we're a month behind. So we still had another month to go before harvesting these plots. But you can see, we knew it was present in all the plots. It's about 5 to 7% in that non-treated control, September 21st. And then we come back 2 weeks later, and that's the way our plots look like. And I know that's probably what you've experienced in your fields. If you had this in your farm, you went away, you thought the crop was looking really good, and you came back and it was completely blighted. So this is kind of what we're trying to focus in on, and how do we slow this down. So fungicides, we do have a large number of fungicides now that are labeled or 2E labeled, and I know I don't have everything here. But again, we have a bunch that are available, and we tried to look at all the fungicides that were available on their efficacy for tar spot here in Indiana. So we did trials that looked at efficacy, we looked at timing, we tried some timing by efficacy, and then hybrid by fungicide. And so this is just an aerial shot of our field trial at Pinney. So you can see that we do have some good areas where we're able to keep that crop greener longer. And so that's good news, is some of these fungicides will work. The important factor that we're learning is timing is going to be critical. And we haven't been able to answer all the questions on going in with a later fungicide application. So I have more questions than I had starting off. We keep adding more questions on how to best handle this disease. So looking at fungicides, we ran a uniform trial across the region. So this was run here in Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And we looked at our range of our products: TrivaPro, Delaro, Meravis, Headline, TopGuard, Quilt, Veltima, Approach. We pulled all the products that we generally see in corn, and we tried to look at them. So again, disease started about 13th of July, and we put our fungicide. So this trial we're starting from ground zero. So let's go with our standard VTR1 application. So that went out at the 8th of August. We have a residual protection, 2 to 3 weeks. And so this is what we rated on those diseases. So again, this is our non-treated, is similar disease cycle that I showed earlier, and then the fungicides. And so as you can see, as they fill in, the good news is all the fungicides shifted that disease cycle. So they protected the crop for those 2 to 3 weeks that they're designed to protect. But you can see as soon as that chemistry runs out of steam, the disease is going to take right off in the crop canopy. So this kind of tells me that timing is going to be really critical. We need to be out looking for the disease to make that timely application most effective. So again, this year with that first find on 13th of July, it was low in the canopy for a while. That VTR1 application worked really well. But again, I suspect if we had greener canopy longer, all those treatments would end up as high as level as the non-treated control as well. So following the similar line, how green did the crop canopy stay? Again, most of the products significantly reduced the necrosis in the crop canopy, which corresponded to an increase in percent staying green longer. So the idea is, how long can we keep that crop canopy as green as long as possible in order to protect that yield? And then yields. So this, I'm going to show a couple slides just to, this disease in this field trial only got up to about 23%. So we did not see significant differences in the yield statistically, which I want to see generally before I give a yes or no on the yield bump. But I do want to note that in this trial, we saw with the fungicide, any of those fungicides, it ranged from 3 to 21 bushels per acre. And we were able to reduce tar spot by all the applications. I had a bunch of other trials out. And so we had, I want to say 9 different efficacy trials running out of those plots. And so I just want to share one where the earleaf disease level got above that 30%. We're at 40% there on the earleaf. We've significantly reduced tar spot. This trial also had lodging, so we were able to see that all the fungicides protect that stalk integrity and improve lodging over the non-treated. And then here, all the fungicides tightly clustered, increasing yield over the untreated. So this so this trial, where we had a little bit more disease pressure, we got over that 30 threshold. We see about 20 to 20 bushel per acre increase with that VTR1 application of most of those products. And so I went back to all those trials and tried to look across why did some not work and others did, where we saw that. I want to see the statistically significant differences. So in 7 of the 9 trials, we do have significant yield difference, and it's the severity of 35 or 40% that occurred on the ear leaf. We had 2 trials, and the one I just showed you was one of those that only got up to 24%, and the other reached 4%. So when we don't have as much yield disease impact, we may not see the separations we want to see on the yield impact for these different diseases. But I think the good news is most of these products do reduce tar spot. And generally, if tar spot gets really heavy, we are going to see a significant yield boost for putting out a fungicide application. This is just after 1 year of data, but I'm trying to get as much information together as we can. So hopefully after this year and a couple years down the road, we'll be able to narrow in, maybe separate out products like an A and B group. But again, I think it's good news that most of these products will reduce tar spot and can protect a lot of our yield potential. So again, we had trials across the region. This is a similar set of trials in Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana. And again, this is kind of what I was talking about before. When we don't see that significant impact disease amount, that's where we're not going to see the separation yield. But again, this is looking at just tar spot. So again, we had a range in tar spot. Indiana had the highest at this 24%, Illinois at 11, Michigan and Wisconsin around 3. But when we pull all the data together, there is still a large group of fungicides, even across all the regions, that do show significant reduction in tar spot over the non-treated. And that's important to show this replication of data, to show that we're seeing consistent products perform equally as well across the regions. But again, depending on the disease pressure, the yields don't separate out as much. So Michigan had a snow move in, so they didn't have any yield on their trial. But you can see in some of ours, we do see some of our products do show significant yield boost over the untreated control at least. But again, I would like to see 2 or 3 more years of data to really give you good, solid answers, but I know we need to do something this year. So this is kind of the information we're trying to present. And then the other thing I've been asked about is lodging. And so these are our trials here at Pinney. I could walk around the outside edge of our research trials and almost push over every corn plant. So yes, this is all due to tar spot, and what it's doing is it's starving that central stalk. But I do say you got to cut the stalks open to really look at it. As you can see here, those stalks were clean, so we didn't have any other diseases moving in. This was mainly due just to the starvation factor of tar spot blighting all those leaves. The corn's trying to finish, and it's just increasing the risk of lodging in our field trials. In another location up at St. Joe County, you can see we had significant lodging. There was a lot of tar spot in the canopy, but I just want to acknowledge you really got to cut open those stalks, because this had also a lot of Fusarium, Gibberella, Anthracnose moving in as well. So it is important. It may not just be one disease problem. There could be multiple diseases out there that may cause some of these lodging issues to occur. The other question we had was on timing. And so we did have a multi-state timing trial looking at the various application timings. So we had a V7, V9, V10, VTR1, R2, and then a double hit of V7, VT. So as you can see, again, those early applications really didn't shift the disease curve down, but it's those late, that VT to R2 application, where we significantly reduced disease. So again, based on the tar spot starting on the 13th of July, these later applications worked really well. I don't have the answer what happens when the disease starts in June. We'll maybe down the line have those answers, so that may shift the need to put on an earlier application if the disease starts earlier in the crop canopy. And because of that, we are working on a model. For Indiana this past year, our model never triggered. And what we learned is the model wasn't taking, in fact, the factors of rainfall. It was looking at just relative humidity and temperature. And so we've now gone backwards and remodified the model, and I'll show you some of that if I got time at the end. But again, here, our VT R2 applications, we do see it significantly reduces tar spot on the ear leaf, and that resulted in corresponding yield benefit of almost 20 bushels per acre. So in general, I'm comfortable saying with our well-timed VTR1 application, a well-timed fungicide application can protect about 20 bushels when we have severe disease. That's kind of what we learned from 2019. We also wanted to look at this interaction. If we can find some hybrids that have more resistance, what does that mean on our fungicide application? Will we need that additional input? So we tried to pull some hybrids from the 2018 trials to try to identify some that may fall in a range. What we ended up was really just a susceptible and a moderately resistant or susceptible lines. So here we have the amount of tar spot that developed within a susceptible, so our W2585, highly susceptible to tar spot, had about 35% infection, versus some other lines, the DLS RPM and the P0589, that were able to keep tar spot about 5%. So the good news is there are some lines that may be able to slow disease progress down within the crop canopy. And so because they're able to keep it low, the additional of a fungicide application at VTR1 really didn't improve that disease control. But you can see if we have a susceptible line, we do significantly reduce tar spot as compared to a non-treated. And then if you look at the corresponding yields, again, there's variability in the hybrid backgrounds, but you can see on the susceptible line, this W2585, that where we added that fungicide, we are able to increase the yield potential. So again, this is kind of an integrated management thoughts. If we can identify those with more resistance, we may not need that additional fungicide input. But identifying those hybrids is still up in the air, but we have identified a few at least that may help to minimize it. So it's just something to think about. And then I did mention this Tar Spotter app. So we're working with the University of Wisconsin, Damon Smith. He already does, he has a white mold app. So we're using the shell of this white mold app to try to put in the factors for tar spot to try to give us an idea of when we may need to go out to the fields to spray. When we ran this epidemiology and model trials across the various locations, again, across all locations, the best timing turned out to be this VTR2 timing. And again, the model didn't work because both Illinois and Indiana's models never triggered. They missed they missed that rainfall within our regions. They worked for Michigan and Wisconsin. Now that he has some more Indiana and Illinois data, they're able to pull that back into the model and remodify it and make it more localized, specific for each location. So again, we started with just a relative humidity temperature model. We've now moved into one that also includes mean temperature and dew point and rainfall. Also with the new model, we'll be able to put in yes or no, you put a fungicide out, so it'll shift the model. If you put a fungicide out, you won't need to spray for 2 to 3 weeks. And then also it's adding if you have irrigation, because we're learning that irrigation is another big factor on the development of this disease. So if we look at the models, here's where Wisconsin had both models running. So version 1 is the blue model line, and version 2 is orange. Again, you can see both models for Wisconsin run similarly. They cross their thresholds at the same time, and he observed tar spot about 2 to 3 weeks after the models crossed their action thresholds. When we look at the Indiana data, you can see where the first version missed our rainfall that happened through Porter County. But when we put those factors in, you can see we crossed this green action threshold about the 21st of July, and we see tar spot on the 2nd of August. So again, this pulls us closer to, yes, the environmental conditions became conducive for those spores to be released and infect the leaf tissue, and we're able to then get an idea of when we need to be putting out a fungicide application for protection. So the idea is this VTR2 application did get out in timely manner to then protect that crop canopy. So we're still working on these models. We're going to be evaluating them again 1 more year, and then hopefully we'll have a beta version for people to test out on their fields that have, especially if you have a field with a history, you might be able to use these models. And finally, I just want to end on the fact that we know environment is going to drive tar spot. So this is just an example of a field up in Michigan this last year. And you can see that tar spot there's a big problem with tar spot under the irrigation line. This whole field had a fungicide put out at R1. The biggest problem that happened here was their pump wasn't working, and so they were doing multiple low levels of irrigation in a field a year. So the crop in a week. So they were irrigating twice a week, low levels. The crop canopy was staying wet all week long, and it just caused the disease to explode within that crop canopy. So again, irrigation seems to be driving this disease. We're providing more free water for it to infect and cause the disease cycle to continue. Frequent light irrigation seems to drive the disease. Again, the idea is tar spot needs about at least 8 hours of leaf wetness for infection. So again, it's these long periods of leaf wetness that are going to let this disease take off within the crop canopy. And they've seen this effect both here where we had fungicides put out timely, it didn't work, and also in some resistant hybrids that also saw high levels of disease when just the conditions were so conducive to tar spot, they just couldn't hold out and keep the disease low. So some of the practices we're currently recommending, if you can identify, try to avoid those highly susceptible hybrids. When you're looking at fungicides, we're recommending finding something with a mixed mode of action, so 2 or more products, and timing is going to be critical. Again, the VTR1 worked this year, but depending on where the disease shifts, may suggest that we may need to go a little later or a little earlier in order to get that application window out in the right time. We're still looking at how do we manage irrigation, and rotation and residue as well are ongoing projects. So I just say get out and scout, keep an eye on it early. We're going to be out there all season looking for it. We'll try to keep you posted when we start seeing activity and getting the word out that maybe you should be looking around to see if you can find it in your fields. So it's here in Indiana. It's going to continue to spread. It's going to be highly dependent on our environmental conditions, and we'll just try to keep you posted as much as we can, especially as we still try to learn more about this disease. So if you suspect it, you can send samples into the Plant Pest and Diagnostic Lab. Again, we have funding to support samples to be sent in for free. And you can contact me if you have any questions. So I can turn it over to open it up for questions.
Okay.
Anybody have any questions? I know I threw a lot at you. I can say we do know we need to look at late applications, so R3, R4, R5. That is on our radar. For this upcoming season, we will be looking at putting out those later applications to see if we really need to protect further out into the growing season.
Looks like Wayne may have had a question.
That's you.
That's me, yeah.
So you got to unmute, Jeff.
Dwayne, did you have a question? I saw your box light up there a minute ago.
I don't.
Okay. Ben?
I was just going to ask, so the later you can apply a fungicide if you need to, as long as it's not too late that the disease is progressed. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's what we're thinking. So I don't know how good a fungicide is going to do to catch up. So that's the one thing we don't have the answer for. That later application worked really well this year. I just don't know if we'll be able to catch up if the disease gets a higher level than that 2 to 5% in lower canopy. But we are looking at, I know there are reports that they went out with 2 fungicide applications later on and saw some yield benefits. But again, we didn't do any of that work yet. But we will be looking at multiple applications and that late timing to see if that really can protect. Because I know we're losing some still on that far end when those fungicides at the VTR1, they're running out of steam before we reach R5. And so the question is,
Hello.
Right.
yeah, so we're still trying to figure that out. But I guess it's just keeping an eye on it. I think we still need to minimize the disease early on as it's getting ramped up, because I really don't know if we can catch up once it starts taking off. Because again, we're seeing the stroma, forming 2 weeks out, so we really can't see what's in that initial infection, how widespread it is.
Okay, thanks.
There are some questions I see in the chat. So maturity of corn make a difference. I think what we're seeing is these later maturing varieties, they have more green material available later in the season. So if the disease is ramped up early, then our later maturing varieties are going to stay green longer, and they're opening the door for more disease to move in then. And I think that's what we're seeing maybe on maturity levels. But yes, and then the questions, we do have it recorded. I think Jeff's going to release this. Somehow he's going to post the recording later. And that my PowerPoint is up there as well. And then again, you can contact me with any free questions or other things that pop up as you review those. Beta test the model. We're not, you can send me an email. We might be able to add a few people for testing it. What we're needing for testing it is, if you have a field with a history, we really want to record that first infection point to really test our models. So you can contact me if you're interested. We can add a few people to just get more locations in Indiana. That would be helpful.
Darcy, any feel for how effective it is to spray with an airplane versus ground-based equipment?
I've gotten this question. I've never done any work on any of those, but I have seen some work that was just done, and I kind of would wish someday I'd like to try to do this, a spray rodeo, to look at that. But some work was done on Ontario and in, I think, in Wisconsin, where they looked at this biplane, helicopter, and all sorts of spray equipment. And so what they saw is, yes, there's a difference in volume being put out, so you can see the water coverage is different, but when they evaluated the chemistry, so they were putting out a sulfur chemistry that they could take back leaf samples and look at how much got on the leaf, they were seeing that they were all consistent in putting the right coverage from that initial trial. I can tell you tar spot is going to tell us how good our coverage is. If we miss a corner, you're going to see it. I've seen leaves that were folded when we got the application out, and you could see right where that middle vein or that stripe missed, the application wasn't on that leaf. So this disease is going to tell us yes or no and how good you are at covering your acreage. If you no-till, should you plan on an early application and a later one? I really don't have any answers on no-till versus conventional. I've seen it in both type fields. The disease activate early. So my suggestion is really get out and keep an eye on those fields. If you're trying to catch it early, I go under those areas that may be cooler and closed canopy, where it's a little cooler in that canopy, to try to find stroma. Looking at that,
I'm talking to you right now.
lower leaves.
Listening.
And then, make a decision on when that application needs to be going out. I don't know. The 2 applications has me leery, but I guess you got to see how active it is in those environmental conditions. If we're hot and dry, it's going to slow this disease down. So I guess we got to pay close attention to the environmental conditions in your county. But just some of those early applications may be missing the window if the disease is inactive. So that's the one thing, is if we go early, they're not doing anything for the disease. They're not there. And it's the late, generally we're seeing it come in later, but we will definitely keep you posted if we start seeing activity early in June or whatever, once we get the crop planted.
Or Pete.
Any other?
Some of the products are saying that they're systemic versus like a contact product. Are there any differences in that?
We haven't gotten down into the specifics on each product. I think you need both. I think we need to slow it down within the leaf and protect those new leaves. So I would say definitely look for a mixed mode of action with both activities on slowing it down. Someone else was going to ask a question.
Does it overwinter on the leaf or the stalk?
It's overwintering. Well, we picked up leaf material for where we detected it. But it could be on some of, if you had stroma on those stalks, it might be surviving in your field. But we were finding on the leaf material, and I know there's a question, if there's not much leaf material there, how is it there? And so I don't have that answer to if how much leaf material really needs to be present for those stroma to survive. We're going to be looking at ways to try to see if we can isolate it from the soil to see how much inoculum is really there, but we're not quite there yet on having the tools ready to do that.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I will try to post this to the Purdue Extension Elkhart County website, since we'll have a video, and it'll probably take me a day or two to get it up there. They're usually pretty big files, and it takes a while to get them uploaded, but we'll get that out there for everybody to watch, and then advertise that it's there so people can watch it from home also. So, any closing thoughts or comments?
I just want to wish everybody luck at planting. We're going to still move forward on it here, so.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Yep.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Never done this before. I don't know how to leave the meeting. Oh,
I could hit a button right here and you'll all be gone real quick.
Yep, he's got it. You'll get it.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Hey, you're welcome. Thank you very much, Darcy. Appreciate it.
Holler if you need anything.
Okay.